All right, let's dive into another deep dive. Today we're tackling hip mobility.
Yeah.
Specifically something called hip impingement.
Yikes.
We're using a guide that breaks down some really effective mobilizations. And you can actually do these on your own, which is awesome.
Yeah.
And get this, a similar technique actually helped a powerlifter break a world record squat.
Wow.
Crazy, huh? Ready to get into it?
Absolutely. Hip impingement is more common than people think.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's basically when the head of your femur, that big thigh bone, bumps up against the edge of your hip socket.
I see.
The acetabulum.
Okay.
Now imagine every time you move your hip, that bone is rubbing.
Oh.
No wonder it can cause pain and limit your range of motion.
Right. I bet you've already felt that yourself. Like, think about activities where you really bend at the hip. Squats, running, even just walking. If your hips are restricted, you're going to feel it.
You're going to feel it.
So how do we actually address this? The guide starts with a technique called gentle hip distraction.
Gentle hip distraction.
Have you heard of this?
Yeah. So this technique uses a band and a foam roller to gently pull the femur away from the socket.
Okay.
By creating this distraction, we're decompressing the joint capsule.
Okay.
This takes the pressure off sensitive structures in the hip,
Interesting.
like the labrum and surrounding ligaments, allowing for better fluid movement.
So it's more than just pulling the bones apart.
Yeah.
We're actually affecting the tissues within the joint itself.
Exactly.
And what's great about this technique is that it seems pretty straightforward. Anyone can do this at home with minimal equipment.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's accessible, and you don't need a physical therapist to guide you.
Okay.
But even though it's a gentle technique, you should still pay attention to how your body responds.
Makes sense.
If there's any sharp pain,
Right.
Stop and consult with a professional.
Got it. Safety first.
Yeah.
Always a good reminder. So let's say gentle hip distraction feels okay. Where do we go from there? What's the next level up?
The guide suggests building on that distraction with a technique called cueing internal rotation with distraction.
Okay.
Now, remember how I mentioned the femur can rub against the socket? Well, sometimes it's going to lead to limited internal rotation of the hip.
Wait, hold on. Internal rotation.
Yeah.
What exactly does that mean in practical terms?
Think about how your leg rotates inwards.
Okay.
When you point your toes towards each other, that's internal rotation.
I see.
Hip impingement can restrict this movement, making it harder to perform certain actions.
Okay.
Try this. Sit down with your feet flat on the floor.
Okay.
Now try to turn your knees inwards towards each other.
Okay, I'm doing it.
If that feels restricted or uncomfortable, it could be a sign of limited internal rotation.
Yeah, I think I'm feeling that a little bit.
Yeah.
And that can affect so many everyday activities, from walking to even getting out of a car.
Absolutely. And that's where this technique comes in.
Okay.
By combining the distraction with internal rotation, we're targeting those specific restrictions.
I see.
Essentially encouraging the hip to move more freely in that inward direction.
Okay. I'm starting to get the picture.
Yeah.
So first we create space in the joint with gentle distraction.
Right.
Then we add in internal rotation to address that specific restriction.
Exactly.
What's next in this hip mobility toolkit?
Well, if you really want to reset the position of the hip joint, the guide suggests hip capsule mobilization.
Interesting.
This is particularly helpful for people who experience something called a flexion wall when they squat.
Flexion wall. That sounds a little ominous.
Yeah.
Can you break that down for me?
Imagine you're squatting down.
Okay.
At some point, you might hit a limit where your femur bumps into the front of your pelvis, preventing you from going any deeper.
Okay.
That's your flexion wall.
Ouch.
This technique helps address that by mobilizing the hip capsule, which is essentially the connective tissue surrounding the hip joint.
So it's almost like we're giving the hip joint a little bit of a realignment so it can move through its full range of motion more effectively.
Yeah.
And the guide suggests that this can dramatically improve hip flexion and overall mechanics.
It can, yeah.
Which sounds pretty impactful.
However, remember what we said earlier. Listen to your body.
Right.
If you feel any sharp pain,
Yeah.
stop and seek professional guidance.
Of course.
With any of these techniques, the goal is to work with your body, not against it.
All right. I'm taking notes.
Good.
Gentle approach. Listen to my body.
Yeah.
But you know what I love?
What's that?
Real life examples of how these techniques can work. And the guide mentions a pretty amazing one. power lifter Donnie Thompson.
Oh, yeah, I know that one.
Have you heard the story?
Oh, absolutely. It's a great example of how addressing even seemingly small restrictions can make a huge difference.
Wow.
Donnie Thompson was attempting a world record squat and failed his first 3 attempts.
Can you imagine the pressure?
I know, right?
But instead of giving up, he did something really interesting.
He used a hip capsule mobilization technique, very similar to the one we just discussed.
Wow. And
guess what? He went on to break the world record on his 4th attempt.
no way.
It's a testament to how powerful these techniques can be.
That's incredible. Like finding a secret lever in your body that suddenly unlocks a whole new level of performance.
Yeah.
And it highlights that these techniques aren't just for people with pain.
Right.
They can benefit athletes, weekend warriors, really anyone looking to improve their movement.
Exactly. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
I was going to say, we've only scratched the surface of hip mobility here.
We have.
That's what I love about these deep dives. We get to delve into the details and really understand the why behind the what.
Absolutely.
And we still got so much more to explore.
We do.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's take a moment to recap what we've learned so far.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, go for it.
We've covered 3 key techniques for improving hip mobility. Gentle hip distraction,
Right.
cueing internal rotation with distraction,
Yes.
and hip capsule mobilization. Each technique targets specific restrictions in the hip, aiming to improve range of motion and overall function.
And we learned that even elite athletes like Donnie Thompson can benefit from these techniques, proving that addressing hip restrictions can enhance performance for anyone. This is already giving me a whole new perspective on how I move.
Yeah,
I bet our listeners are feeling it too.
I bet so.
But we've got a lot more ground to cover.
We do.
So stay tuned for part 2 of our hip mobility deep dive. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to our deep dive into hip mobility.
So before the break, we were discussing how even elite athletes like Donnie Thompson can benefit from addressing hip restrictions.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that these techniques aren't just for people experiencing pain.
Right.
They can enhance performance for just about anyone.
Absolutely. But how do we know when we're pushing too far? That's a good question. What are the warning signs that we need to back off?
Pain is always a signal to stop and reassess.
Okay.
If you're feeling any sharp stabbing pain, or if the pain is getting worse, those are definite signs that you need to ease up.
Okay.
It's also important to pay attention to how your body feels the day after doing these mobilizations.
I see.
If you're experiencing increased soreness or stiffness,
Right.
you may have pushed too hard.
So it's not a no pain, no gain situation.
Right.
We want to be mindful and respectful of our bodies.
Absolutely. It's about understanding the mechanics of the hip joint, identifying the specific restrictions,
Okay.
and then using these techniques to gently encourage more movement.
You know, it's interesting how connected our hips are to the rest of our body.
Yeah.
I've noticed that when my hips feel tight, it seems to affect everything from my lower back to my knees.
That's a great observation.
Really?
And it makes perfect sense anatomically. The hips are quite literally the foundation of our movement, connecting our upper body to our lower body.
I see.
They play a crucial role in just about everything we do,
Wow.
from walking and running to squatting, bending, and even sitting.
So if our hips are restricted, it would create a chain reaction of problems throughout the body,
Exactly.
like a domino effect.
Precisely. Tight hips can lead to what we call compensatory patterns,
Okay.
where other muscles and joints have to work harder to compensate for the lack of mobility in the hips.
So if one part isn't pulling its weight, another part has to pick up the slack.
Yeah, and over time, this can lead to pain, stiffness, and even injuries in areas that seem completely unrelated to the hips.
That makes sense.
Exactly. And that's why addressing hip mobility is so important.
Okay.
It's not just about the hips themselves.
Right.
It's about optimizing the function of our entire body.
Okay. I'm convinced. Hip mobility is important.
Good.
But for someone who's just starting out, where do they begin?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
The first step is awareness. Start paying attention to how your hips feel throughout the day. Do you notice any tightness or restriction?
Okay.
Are there certain movements that are difficult or painful?
Gotcha.
The guide even suggests keeping a little journal to track your observations.
So like a hip mobility diary.
Exactly. It can be really helpful to track your progress and identify patterns.
Okay.
Once you have a better understanding of your own hip mobility, you can start exploring different techniques to address any limitations.
Okay.
The techniques we've discussed are a great starting point.
And you mentioned that there are other resources out there.
Oh, yeah?
What would you suggest for someone who wants to delve deeper into the world of hip mobility?
Absolutely. There are tons of resources available,
Like what?
from books and articles to videos and online courses.
Awesome.
You can also find qualified professionals like physical therapists and movement specialists who can assess your individual needs and create a personalized plan for you.
This guide also mentions other issues, like arthritis and knee pain that can benefit from these techniques.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
The guide highlights the interconnectedness of our bodies, reminding us that hip restrictions can contribute to a wide range of issues, not just pain in the hips themselves.
So someone experiencing knee pain might actually benefit from addressing their hip mobility.
Yeah, think about it.
That seems counterintuitive.
It might seem that way,
Okay.
but if the hips aren't moving properly, it can change the way we walk and move,
Right.
putting extra stress on the knees.
I see.
By improving hip mobility, we can often alleviate some of that stress and reduce knee pain.
Interesting.
The guide even suggests specific techniques that may help with this.
It's like a detective game, figuring out the root cause of an issue instead of just treating the symptom.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of understanding the body as a whole.
Yeah.
It allows us to approach our health in a more holistic and integrated way.
Okay, so far we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We've learned about hip impingement.
Yeah.
Explored different mobilization techniques, and even discussed how hip mobility can impact other areas of the body.
Right.
We're really starting to see the bigger picture here.
We are.
But before we wrap up, let's talk about how we can actually integrate these techniques into our busy lives.
That's a great point. It's one thing to understand the theory,
Right.
but putting it into practice is where the real magic happens.
Okay.
Let's dive into some strategies for making hip mobility a part of your everyday life in part 3.
All right, so we're back, and the big question is, how do we actually make hip mobility a part of our daily lives?
Yeah, because let's face it, we're all busy people.
We are.
And that's why it's so important to find ways to integrate these techniques seamlessly into your existing routine. The guide emphasizes that it doesn't have to be a huge time commitment.
Okay.
Even just a few minutes here and there can make a difference.
So it's more about consistency than spending hours doing complicated stretches.
Exactly. Small, consistent efforts add up over time. Think about it like brushing your teeth.
Okay.
You don't spend an hour brushing, but you do it every day.
Right.
And that consistency keeps your teeth healthy.
I like that analogy.
Hip mobility can be approached in a similar way.
So what are some practical ways to sneak in those few minutes of hip mobility work?
One suggestion from the guide is to incorporate some mobilizations into your warm-up or cool-down routine.
Okay.
Instead of just doing static stretches, why not try the gentle hip distraction technique we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
It's a great way to prep your hips for activity or help them recover afterwards.
You know, I usually just do a few quick stretches before I work out.
Yeah.
But now that I'm thinking about it, my hips often feel a bit tight, especially after sitting at my desk all day.
Right.
Maybe I should swap out some of those static stretches for something more targeted.
I think you'd be surprised at how much of a difference even a few minutes of focused hip work can make.
Wow.
And remember, it doesn't have to be limited to your workouts. You can incorporate these techniques throughout the day.
Like when I'm taking a break from work or even watching TV?
Absolutely. Some of these techniques, like the cueing internal rotation with distraction, can be done in a variety of positions.
Yeah.
You don't need a lot of space or any equipment. Just a few minutes here and there can really add up.
I'm starting to see how this could actually fit into my life.
Yeah.
It's not about adding another item to my to-do list.
Right.
It's about finding little pockets of time throughout the day to move my body in a way that feels good
Exactly.
and helps improve my hip mobility.
Precisely. And speaking of finding pockets of time, let's address the elephant in the room. Sitting.
Yeah.
Many of us spend hours sitting at a desk,
Too many.
which can wreak havoc on our hip mobility.
Right. Our hips are basically in a flexed position for hours on end.
Yeah.
That can't be good.
It's not ideal.
What can we do about that?
Well, the guide offers some simple yet effective strategies for combating the negative effects of prolonged sitting. One suggestion is to set a timer to get up and move around every hour.
Yep.
Even if it's just for a few minutes,
Right.
take a walk, do some quick stretches, or even try a few of the hip mobilizations we've discussed.
So instead of just refilling my coffee, I could actually refill my hip mobility, so to speak,
Exactly.
get the blood flowing, move those joints through their full range of motion.
And you can also make small adjustments to your workspace.
Like what?
Try using a standing desk or a stability ball for part of the day.
Okay.
Even something as simple as adjusting your chair height can make a difference.
And what about for those of us who are into strength training? I know a lot of our listeners hit the gym regularly. How does hip mobility play into that?
That's a crucial point, and the guide devotes a whole section to it.
Okay.
Hip mobility is essential for proper form and technique in many strength training exercises, especially squats and deadlifts.
I can see how restricted hips would make those movements really difficult.
Yeah.
Maybe even dangerous.
Exactly. If your hips aren't moving freely, you're more likely to compensate with other parts of your body,
Right.
which can put you at risk for injury.
That makes sense.
The guide suggests incorporating specific hip mobility exercises into your warm-up to ensure your hips are properly prepared for those big lifts.
So before you even think about loading up that barbell, I need to make sure my hips are ready to rock and roll.
Absolutely.
It's like laying a good foundation before you build a house.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just about injury prevention.
Okay.
Improved hip mobility can actually enhance your performance.
Oh, really?
When your hips are mobile, you can move more efficiently, generate more power, and lift heavier weights.
That's what I like to hear.
It's a win-win situation. Better mobility means less risk of injury and better performance in the gym.
Exactly.
Precisely. And the benefits extend beyond the gym.
Yeah.
Improved hip mobility can make everyday activities easier and more enjoyable, whether you're playing with your kids, hiking in the mountains, or simply getting up and down from a chair.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive into hip mobility. It has been. We've covered so much ground, from understanding the mechanics of the hip joint to exploring specific mobilization techniques.
Yeah.
And even addressing the mental and emotional aspects of movement.
You're right. The guide reminds us that when our bodies move well, we tend to feel better overall, both physically and mentally.
So true.
It can boost our mood, improve our sleep, and even reduce stress levels.
That's a great reminder that movement is so much more than just physical exercise. It's about connecting with our bodies, feeling good in our own skin, and living life to the fullest.
Absolutely. And it all starts with taking that first step, becoming aware of our movement patterns, and making small, consistent efforts to improve.
So if you're listening to this and feeling inspired to get moving, don't wait. Start today.
Yeah.
Try incorporating some of the techniques we've discussed into your daily routine.
And remember, this deep dive is just a starting point.
Right.
There's a whole world of information and resources available to help you on your hip mobility journey.
That's right. Keep exploring,
Yeah.
keep moving, and keep those hips happy.
Good advice.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive, nerd.